The first century BC was a very turbulent time in the Roman world, and the Roman authorities who were running the empire, which had swept around the Eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, etc., as well as the West, were very concerned about anything that would be disruptive. You know, they had laws against people meeting in groups of more than just a handful. I was thinking about this as I was flying on the aeroplane, that they don't let you get together with 4 or 5 friends up near where you go through to the cockpit, because they're still frightened about 9/11, about conspiracies. Now, that's how it was in the Roman Empire, that they didn't want subversive elements getting together and plotting things behind closed doors. And that tells you something about security, and that great motto that the Romans had, peace and security. Irene kai asphalia in Greek. I mean, I think in Greek because the eastern half of the empire and Paul's letters, of course, are in Greek. But that sense of Augustus has brought peace to the world, which simply meant that he was the last man standing after the civil wars. But that was really, really important, because the Romans didn't do civil wars at home. They exported them. They had battles amongst themselves in parts of Greece or Turkey or wherever. And so the whole world knew what it meant to live in a world which was turbulent and people against one another. But then the whole idea of security, of being able to rely on everything working properly and normally, and not having riots and so on, that's absolutely vital. And along with that, one which became very important under Augustus, but though it's actually around in the Roman world before, but I think becomes a divinity under Augustus, is justice, justitia in Latin, or dikaiosyne in Greek. And these things are enormously important, that we Romans believe in justice and we export justice to the rest of the world who clearly needs it. So peace, security, justice, and in order to create a world in which these are possible, the word salvation is actually quite important. Salvation not in terms of what's going to happen to you after death, but in terms of putting things right that are at present wrong in society. Now, there are many others, but that's where I would start. We have a problem today in talking about ancient religion, because the word religion has come in the last 3 centuries in Western Europe and North America to mean something quite different from what it meant. I mean, completely different, because in the first century, religio were the things that bound you together as a community and bound you to the gods. Whereas since the 17th, 18th century in Europe and then in North America, religion by definition is something that happens in a different sphere to where the rest of society is. So you have politics and society here and religion over there. Now, that split is now quite under threat. I've just got back from America and discussing it with friends there. They say, yeah, it really doesn't work anymore like we thought it did. But that's how the word religion and things like departments of religion, they have studied the way that people behave in relation to a supposed non-terrestrial reality. Whereas in the first century, I mean, Cicero writes about religion. Actually, he writes about religions, plural, because for him, offering sacrifice to the gods is a religion, that's an obligation, something which you are bound to do. Examining auspices before going into a battle, that's a religion. Consulting sacred oracles would be a religion. And this is very, very confusing. So when we talk about ancient religion, we're always in danger of back projecting what we mean by religion into the ancient world. One of the scholars that I studied some years ago put it like this, that any given city or country had 2 sorts of inhabitants: the visible ones, the living human beings who are walking around, and the invisible ones, the gods and perhaps the ancestors, who were around, and they were important. They were part of the fabric of society. It's just you couldn't see them, but they needed to be kept on side. You needed to honor them, you needed to offer sacrifice, you needed to worship and offer prayers, etc., in order that the whole thing would somehow work together. And if bad things happened, if people found that there was a fire or a flood or whatever it was threatening the city, this would be because the proper religion had not been observed. Not religion in our sense, but drawing together the ordinary people who were around with the gods or the ancestors or whoever. So it's really difficult to talk about it in terms of what they believed then, because actually belief was not something that was particularly important. It was just assumed. The philosophers did push back at some of these things. People like Plutarch at the end of the first century saying, those old tales about the gods in Homer, we have to assume that the gods aren't like that really. Therefore, Homer must be a book of allegories, and we have to decode the allegories. But if the philosophers were pushing back, that was perceived to be a bit dangerous. You might stop the ordinary people from doing what they ought to do, and then the gods would be angry. And so that's a world which is quite different from what most people in the modern Western world think of. So we need to rephrase our questions in the light of that distinction. Yeah, I mean, the Christians sort of overlap at certain points, so that if you imagine somebody who gained access to an early Christian meeting, they might recognize some of the things that the Christians were doing in terms of, oh, that's rather like what's going on in Mithras's shrine or whatever, particularly, for instance, the Eucharist being like a collective meal that people would have in honor of the God. And of course, famously then, baptism is not totally unlike some of the rituals of dying and being reborn. But in a sense, that's almost like a side issue, because what people would see if they were observing Christians and what they behaved, it would be more like a cross between a philosophical school, a political movement, a potentially dangerous political movement, and a synagogue. It's an odd combination perhaps to us, but I mean, for instance, in Mithraism and the other religions so-called of the ancient world, they are not teaching you to think philosophically about God, the world, what humans are, etc. Whereas that's pretty important for Christians, and they are not teaching you what we call ethics either. If you want to know how to behave, you go in the ancient world, you go to a philosopher. You don't go to a priest in a shrine, because the priest in the shrine is doing whatever he's doing to offer sacrifice, and he will direct you to sacred oracles if you want, but that's not the way the Christians did it. So there are lots of dissimilarities. And of course, the same is true for Jews in the ancient world. I mean, your synagogue at Ostia, in a sense, it's easy for us to line that up alongside the temples and so on, but what's going on there is very, very different. They're not going and offering sacrifice, because that's what you would do in the temple in Jerusalem, and then, of course, in AD 70, the temple is destroyed, and then the synagogue community is basically a teaching place, a place where people go to pray, but they go to be taught Torah. There is no equivalent to that in the Roman world. You don't go to Mithras in order to hear texts being read and have somebody preaching on how you're to observe them. And so Christianity sits very awkwardly as something which is both like and unlike, and both recognizable and quite unrecognizable. People don't know what to do with it. It's a different thing. But at the center of it is the early Christian basic claim. You see it in Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians. The fundamental thing about being a Christian is that you give up worshipping the gods. You turned from idols to serve a living and true God. So, yes, there are these idols. Everybody knows there are many so-called gods and lords, but we're not like that, because we are like the Jews who have the one God, even though then there are questions about who this one God is. But again, the sort of questions that nobody in the Greco-Roman world of religions, either in Ostia or Philippi or Athens or anywhere else, they weren't asking those sorts of questions. So the Christians are raising questions, and as everybody since Socrates knew, raising questions is dangerous. It subverts the status quo. There's a debate about to what extent, if any, Jewish teachers went around the non-Jewish world teaching people, recruiting people. There's the famous line in Matthew 23 where Jesus says to the Pharisees, you cross land and sea to make a single proselyte, and when you do so you make him more of a child of Gehenna than you yourselves are. But many scholars have argued that actually there's not much evidence for that of Jewish teachers going around and doing that, because what seems to have happened normally is that there were Jewish synagogues all over the place, except where there wasn't much of a Jewish community, like in Philippi, where there is a place of prayer, a prosyche, rather than an actual synagogue. But that then when people observed how the Jews were, how they behaved, how they looked after their own community, and how they didn't behave in the way that some pagans did, quite a lot of, well, what does quite a lot mean? But there were several non-Jewish people who would think, I'd like to belong to this community. And then they would discover that actually there are some big steps to be made if you want to become a full member. So there are lots of what they called God-fearers, who are the people who are around the edge of the synagogue community, who haven't become full Jews, but who are part of that whole way, and probably renouncing the gods themselves, though doing so rather privately and cautiously, lest their non-Jewish neighbors take offense. Because this is the thing. I mean, it's hard for us today to conjure up in our minds the atmosphere of an ancient pagan city where many days of many weeks there would be processions going to somebody's shrine, there would be sacrifices being offered, there would be special festivals in honor of this or that or the other divinity, and you would be expected to show up. And whereas today, on a Sunday here in Oxford, quite a lot of people actually go to church, but most people don't. And if somebody doesn't go to church, then the other people in their church might realize that they were absent, but their neighbors wouldn't say, oh, they didn't go to church. You know, maybe 200 or 300 years ago, people might have done, or 400 or 500 years ago, but that contrasts with how it was in the ancient world. People would know who wasn't doing their civic duty. And one of the key things is to remember that the priests in the cults were very often also the local magistrates, which made sense. They were the ones charged with keeping the peace in the local community and the peace between the visible and the invisible inhabitants of the city. So then the question of the synagogue is that we know that these Jews will not worship the gods. That's a done deal ever since the time of Julius Caesar and before. And many people in the non-Jewish world resented that, but the Jews were in other respects good citizens, or at least they taught one another to be good citizens. So that there was a sort of uneasy truce there. And then the question was, would the Christians be able to shelter under that umbrella or not? And that's a very interesting question, because in Corinth, according to Acts 18, the Roman proconsul Gallio said, oh, this Christianity thing, it's just an inner Jewish movement. So it's nothing to see here, no concern of mine. The result is Christianity becomes legitimate in southern Greece on the same basis that the Jewish people are legitimate, which is both good and bad news in that it means they're not persecuted, so the church can flourish and grow. But if you look at the Corinthian correspondence that Paul had, it's tricky when the church becomes suddenly legitimate and everyone floods in without really bothering whether they match up to the ideals or not. Paul has to say some sharp things to the Corinthian church, which he doesn't have to say to the others. So, but that's the sort of world we're talking about. And so if Christianity is trying to be like the synagogue, only for everybody, and without the entry requirement of circumcision and without the food laws and the Sabbath keeping, well, this is a very odd thing. Nobody knows what this movement is. So we suspect it's subversive, don't we? And when they start talking about Jesus as Kyrios and Soter, Lord and Savior, oh my goodness, this is bad news. You know, him up the road is not going to be pleased. There's all sorts of things going on there which come to a head in certain points. One of the stories I love in the Gospels is when they show Jesus the tribute penny, the denarius from Tiberius, and Jesus says, whose is this image and superscription? And you know what the words round the edge are saying? Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus, Saviour, high priest. Here we are in the temple with Jesus, and the kind of multiple ironies of that are extraordinary. But I think that is a sort of a quintessential moment. But there's an extraordinary undesigned coincidence that Augustus, in the late years BC, so this is before the rise of Christianity, Augustus had got his court historian Livy and his court poets, people like Horace and Ovid, to write up splendidly about the great long story of Rome and how this long story of Rome had finally got to its fulfillment with the arrival of the great Augustus, under whose reign we now had peace and justice and security and all of that stuff. Now, exactly at the same time, but without deriving it from that Roman narrative, the Jews have a story which goes all the way back to Abraham, but which focuses particularly on passages like Daniel 9, which say that one day there is going to be a great turnaround and the Jewish people will be liberated, and Daniel 7 and Daniel 2, which go with Daniel 9, say that there is going to come a king or some sort of representative figure who will destroy the pagan empires and set up a kingdom which cannot be shaken. And I love that sort of sense of completely undesigned coincidences. The Jews are not getting that story from Rome, and the Romans aren't getting it from the Jews, but they both come to a head at the same time. And in both cases, you have this figure who is both royal and divine somehow, we're not quite sure how. And so when the early Christians talk about Jesus as Kyrios, Lord, they're clearly getting that from, because they often quote the Psalms and Isaiah and so on. They're not getting it from the Caesar cult, though some scholars have tried to say they derived it from there. I've, in my work, made the distinction between derivation and confrontation, that it seems to me clear that the Christians are consciously deriving what they say about Jesus from Isaiah, from the Psalms, from Genesis, from all over the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. But it just so happens that some of the things they highlight, they must have known were quite literally on the coins and in the inscriptions around. Certainly the word evangelion. When Paul uses the word evangelion, good news, it seems to me clear that he is consciously echoing Isaiah chapter 40 and Isaiah chapter 52, which is all about the servant of the Lord who is going to defeat the pagans and restore Israel, and will extraordinarily in chapter 53 suffer and die in the process. How Isaiah 53 is being interpreted is itself a good question in this period. But they must have known, because it was literally carved in stone around parts of the empire, that the people who were supporting Caesar, which was pretty well everybody, had the word evangelion for the good news that we have an emperor who has brought justice and peace to the world. And so when I then read the early chapters of the letter to the Romans, particularly chapter 1, we have Jesus as the Son of God, who is the Lord of the world, through whom we have justice and peace and salvation. And you think, Paul, do you realize what you just said? And Paul is pretty savvy. He knows perfectly well what he's just said. That all of this is derived from the Hebrew Scriptures, but confronting the Roman world. And how much that was picked up by Paul's first hearers, we can't say, but they're not stupid. We sometimes have this myth that because we are post-Enlightenment people, we understand how literature works. No, they got it. They knew their myths, they knew their stories, etc. So I think there is an implicit confrontation, but of course then you have the whole point that in the early Christian movement there is a different way of being Lord, and when Paul and the others say that Jesus is Kyrios, this doesn't mean that he's going to rule in the same way that Augustus or Tiberius does. Jesus himself has that very famous passage in Mark 10 where he contrasts the way that pagan rulers rule by brute force and by bullying people with what he is doing, which is the Son of Man came to give his life a ransom for many. So he has not come to be served but to serve. So there is a contrast between two sorts of kingship, two sorts of lordship, And in a sense, the church has spent the last 2,000 years trying to work that one out. I think it's one of the major contrasts between the Jewish world and the Christian world on the one hand, and the ancient non-Jewish Christian world, that the non-Jewish world had things like the Sibylline oracles. They had things like the Delphic oracles, and some things were written down like the Sibyllines, and some you had to go to Delphi and ask your question and get a nice answer in hexameters from the priestess at the shrine at Delphi. They told the non-Jewish, non-Christian people, I'm trying not to use the word pagan because that's controversial, but you know what I mean. They have stories about the ancient world which merge into what we called, and sometimes they called, myth. But those myths are just as important, the myths of Romulus and Remus, or the great Homeric myths, etc. So that you could allude to them and everybody knew what you were talking about. Just like I've observed with my own students, if you allude to something that happened in one of the television soap operas the previous week, everybody knows what was going on, what the motivation was, what the outcome was, etc. In the same way, people in that world lived in that world of myths, of the Orestes myth, of all sorts of things. So that, in a sense, functioned as their Old Testament, but not in the same way that the Jewish Old Testament functioned, because this was a real story about real people that, as it came forward into the present time, particularly since the Babylonian exile, this was about things like the Maccabees, who had been martyred for their refusal to take part in pagan ritual, etc. And the Jews of the first century, as we know from Josephus, were absolutely determined, we're going to be loyal to those traditions. So the traditions which are then there in the scriptures are coming forward, comprising a 2,000-year story to which we are the heirs and to which we have to be loyal. And so when the early Christians pick that up, this becomes one of the great problems. And you see in Justin Martyr in the 2nd century, to whom do the scriptures really belong? Are they actually the Jews who would then say that you Christians have veered off and gone off in an odd direction? Or are they actually fulfilled in Jesus? And if so, how do you know, and what does that mean, and how do we then navigate that tension? But all that's going on, as Gallio said in Corinth, there's a kind of inner Jewish question, but it's a puzzlingly inner Jewish question, in that the Christians, by definition, are not becoming Jews, and that's the problem in Galatians, that there are some who think they'd better just for the sake of peace and quiet. And Paul is saying, no, that's to miss the point. And so at the heart of it all, you have the figure of Jesus. And Jesus remains a very disturbing figure throughout the 1st and 2nd centuries and thereafter. But there we have this very strange phenomenon, which is that the language that they use about Jesus is very similar to things that in the Old Testament are said about Israel's relationship with Yahweh, including Yahweh as bridegroom and Israel as bride, and so Jesus now and his bride, the church, and so on, which is a theme you find in different bits of the Old Testament. And this is telling us that Jesus is both a very striking and interesting and challenging figure of recent memory, and a figure that people can get to know personally in the present. And I think that's what sets the early Christians apart, a sense of Jesus as a living presence. Now, it may be that some devotees of Mithras would say, well, we sense Mithras as a living presence, but I don't think they did in the same way. And likewise, people who were part of the imperial cult, which was the fastest growing so-called religion of the time, they maybe felt Augustus or Tiberius or Nero or whoever as a living presence, in that his face was on the coins, it greeted them wherever they went. But I think, when they went back home and lay down at night, they didn't have a sense of the emperor being personally present with them. And then we might come further on to this, all that meant in terms of a reorientation of their deepest personality of who they were, their families and their community as well as themselves. In a way, it must have been perceived by some at least as a parallel with the Roman Empire. Now that Augustus or whoever has become emperor, his heralds need to go out and tell the world, you know, Augustus is emperor, so pay the tax, and if you don't, it'll be the worse for you, sort of thing. Now, Jesus is Lord, therefore sign on, join in, and the results are very different from Augustus, but there is a sense of a global perspective. But that itself goes back to the Old Testament. I mean, one of the links which hasn't always been made but should be is that the second psalm, which is very popular in the early church, is a kind of universalizing of the promise to Abraham. Abraham is told, I will give you a family and I will give you a land. And the same language of inheritance and so on is used in Psalm 2 to the Davidic king, ask of me and I will give you the nations for your inheritance and the uttermost parts of the world for your possession. And some Jewish thinkers of the first century, Philo of Alexandria being an example, saw that as a mandate for the Jewish people to become influential and to spread the news of the true God and perhaps true ways of behaving around the rest of the world. And Philo talks grandly about that there are Jews in every country of the world and their influence is being felt, kind of thing. I'm broadly summarizing here, but that's part of that same sense. And this, of course, is part of the monotheistic imperative, that if there is one God, and if Israel is God's people, then maybe this one God has worldwide purposes of some sort, through the Jewish people, and then the Christians focus that Jewish identity onto Jesus, believing him to be Messiah, and that's a hugely important thing, which I don't think has a parallel in the same way anywhere in the Greco-Roman world, of the destiny of one whole nation or people landing up on one person, the one who is now the Anointed One, the Mashiach, and that therefore through him the promises to Abraham are fulfilled, that all the families of the earth will be blessed. And Paul minds that seam very deeply, and that's the presupposition behind the four Gospels as well, in all sorts of ways. We're telling this great story from Adam and Abraham and so on, all the way through. It's focused on Jesus, but now, yes, go into all the world. And the end of Matthew's Gospel, same as the end of Luke's Gospel, you have what people have called the Great Commission. But it is based on the fact that Jesus is now hailed as the universal sovereign, which is bound to, it cannot but be counter-imperial. It must be counter-imperial. So it is, in a sense, the translation of that still rather vague Jewish expectation, because for many Jews in the first century, the point is not, are we going to be running the world? The point is, are we going to be rescued from the people who are at present running the world? But Philo, sitting there as a philosopher in Alexandria, though that was uncomfortable sometimes too, could have this global vision. And it's that same global vision that you find in Christianity. But you don't find that in the pagan cults. I mean, there's no sort of sense of, okay, we've established a good shrine to whichever god it is here. Now we've got to go out and establish that elsewhere. No, if people want to come to a shrine of Asclepius, well, they know where that is. They can find out. They can make the journey, stay in an inn, and come and sleep overnight in Asclepius's shrine and hope that they'll be healed. But it's not the same way. It doesn't have that same missionary imperative. Yeah, I'm not sure that it necessarily is, because it is first of all perceived as subversive and as socially dangerous, both because it seems to be undermining the Caesar cult. I mean, it's not in Philippi, but it's in Thessalonica in Acts 17, where they're accused of saying there is another king, namely Jesus. That's bad news. Thessalonica and Philippi are not that far from Rome, but a quick sea passage and then along the main road. But the attractiveness, I think, comes as with people aware of a Jewish community. And these people are living in a different way. They seem to have a different, what we would call a different ethic. They care for one another. They have quite a strong sexual ethic, which to many people, especially women in the ancient world, accustomed to all kinds of murky goings on. This was really appealing. Wow, maybe there is another way of life. Maybe you can order your life like that. They were supposedly straightforward in their business dealings, etc. So they weren't cheating and lying and so on all the time. So people respected that, but it took time for that to bed in and for people to realize that that was so. But as they did, then there was a sense of attraction. But I think to begin with, that was not there. Things were very confusing. And obviously to begin with in Philippi, Paul and co are perceived as a thorough nuisance. But then you have an earthquake and the walls fall down and so on, a dramatic scene. Yes, I would broadly agree on that. I was reading somebody the other day, and I can't remember who it was, but it seems an obvious point, but it isn't always made in this context, that in the ancient world, whatever you believed about the gods, nobody ever said that either Zeus or Athene or any of that lot actually loved you. That they, Athene, you had to go and worship her. If you were in Athens, you had to go to her shrine. You had to pay homage to the gods. And the gods, you might be able to bring them on side and persuade them to support your plans or whatever. But any idea that they loved you and were wanting you to be part of their family and so on, this is quite alien and different. The only people who have a God who loves them are the Jewish people. And so the idea, going back to Deuteronomy and so on, of the love of God comes through very strongly in Christianity. The idea of there being a God who loves you, which is there in the Jewish world, all the way back through the Psalms and Isaiah to Deuteronomy and so on, this is something you just don't find in the ancient pagan world, but it comes then through into Christianity, particularly through the figure of Jesus himself. When Paul says in Galatians 2, the Son of God loved me and gave himself for me, you don't find parallels to that in the mystery religions and so on. You may be able to find your way into the mystery of Mithras, but there's no sense that Mithras actually has come looking for you and embraced you in love. And then the way that this works is that it's not just an idea, it's then lived out by the actual people themselves. Famously, 200 years later, Tertullian is saying that people are saying, look how they love one another, that the Christians cared for one another. This is why church disunity is such a scandal and such a sorrow, that actually it's one of the marks of the Christian church from its earliest days. And you can see this because one of the first controversies in Acts is that they have to figure out there's a slippage in the distribution of food to the widows who are part of their community. And people say, what an odd thing for Luke to highlight. And the answer is no. This shows that they're already living as family within the first decade. And that's one of the meanings of the word agape, love. When Paul says to the Thessalonians, I know that you already love one another, I want you to do so more and more. He doesn't mean, I know you already have warm, fuzzy feelings about one another, I want you to have even warmer and even fuzzier feelings about one another. He means, I know that you're already taking care to look after the poor in your midst and on the fringes, and I want you to put even more effort into doing that, because agape is something you do basically with your whole self, but not least your money. And so the idea of there being a God, just one God, and this one God who's the world's creator, loves you personally, this is a whole new idea. And when they discover that it's true, because here's a community that's actually doing it and living like that and seeing that it works. And then when you say, well, how does that happen? They talk about Jesus. And so Paul says, the Son of God loved me and gave himself for me. John says, when Jesus, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them, eis telos in Greek, which means the last thing love could do, he did. He did everything that that love could do for them. This is again something which you don't find in the other traditions. And I think when we've been discussing this as scholars, we've rather backed off from that, as though that seems to be a declining away from hard sociological analysis and just wandering off into pietism. But actually, when you see the impact that the early Christian communities have, the reason why, despite persecution, people want to join in, is that this is something that they sense is what we might call humanizing or rehumanizing, as opposed to dehumanizing, which was so much the way that so much was. And I think that has to be factored into the whole picture. And of course, again, Jesus is absolutely central to that. And when you look at the stories in the Gospels, and it's one of the problems about the way that we've talked about Christology, talked grandly about who Jesus was perceived to be. If you come forward 3 or 4 centuries, they're inventing formulae about him being totally human and totally divine, etc., etc. But in those formulae, what you miss is the kind of quizzical, friendly, challenging, inquiring, healing, disturbing presence that you find in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so they're telling those Jesus stories which make very personal and very real the big story about a creator God who loves you and the world, and the visible story of a community that is loving one another in a costly way. And when asked why, they say, well, we follow this man Jesus. And that's the big difference, it seems to me. And you can't map that onto the other figures in the ancient world. You know, there may be some loose analogies, but this is a major theme in Christianity, and I think it's one of the major things that sets it apart. The ancient world had many, many different views about what happens after death. All the way from some who say there's nothing after death, the Epicureans, and at a very popular level, the people who put on their tombstones, you know, I was not, I am, I was not, I was, I am not, I don't care. There's just a way of saying we have no idea what that's all about. But then all the way through to a Platonic vision of the great souls going off to the Isles of the Blessed, or to Roman emperors and others becoming divine after their death. So there's a whole spectrum. The Jews, again, divide between those like the Sadducees, who do not believe that there's any, certainly any resurrection, and the Pharisees, who do believe in the resurrection of the body, and then have a certain amount of difficulty about what happens between bodily death and bodily resurrection. But there is a hope, there is a new world. And this goes back to the key thing, belief in the Creator God, that the beliefs of ancient pagans did include various myths about how God or the gods made the world in the first place, but the sense that the world was made good and that it ought to be remade, this is a very Jewish idea, very Old Testament idea. And where you get this belief in a good creator who is also going to put everything right, in other words, creation and justice, when you've got those two, sooner or later you've got resurrection. Because, you know, our bodies are frail things, and certainly at my age it's kind of falling apart a bit, but the sense that God is going to remake the world and remake us with it, this is a very specifically sort of Orthodox Israelite and Jewish view, which then comes through into the Christian view, because of course they believed that Jesus himself had been raised from the dead ahead of time, or everybody else would be eventually, but it had happened to Jesus. And this was a novum, this was not expected. If you were writing things up 100 years later, you would never have invented this idea of one person being raised from the dead in the middle of history to inaugurate this new creation. So the theme of new creation and of the Creator God who loved the world so much that he wanted to recreate it, this is again something which the greatest Jewish teachers could see that this was actually cognate with what they had believed and taught, but putting Jesus in the middle of the picture and rewriting the story around him was not something that they'd been prepared to do. And so that's really where the shoe pinches, if you like. But then particularly for so many people in the ancient world, even if they'd read their philosophy and maybe had an idea that maybe Plato was right, there's still a complete uncertainty about what happens after death, which you see in the grave markers and so on, the sense of hopeless sorrow. And that's why Paul says, I don't want you to grieve like the people who have no hope. And it doesn't say I don't want you to grieve, so I don't want you to grieve like the hopeless people. In other words, there is a Christian way of grieving, which is about hope, that there is a hope, and it's not just a hope for a vague life after death, it's a hope for a re-embodiment in God's new creation. For God to look after you in the meantime. Paul says, my desire is to be with the Messiah, which is far better. It's Philippians 1, but by Philippians 3, he's talking about he will change our humble body to be like his glorious body. So there is a new body, a new creation. And that, of course, is anchored absolutely in the resurrection of Jesus. Take that away, and the whole thing sort of falls apart and becomes then a rather puzzling variant on a Jewish myth. And why would anyone believe that? So ultimately, the figure of Jesus as the embodiment of the Creator's love and as the one who's already gone through death and out the other side ahead of us, that is absolutely vital. There's a passage in the letter to the Hebrews which says that through death he might destroy him who has the power of death, namely the devil, and thereby liberate those who through fear of death were all their life long subject to slavery. And so he's talking about the pagan world in general, who are ultimately afraid of death because they have no idea really what's going to happen. He says, no, Jesus rescues you from that. So there now is a real solid living hope. And that's a new thing in the ancient world, which the critics of Christianity couldn't explain then and actually can't explain now.